Hi class. In this chapter, we'll be comparing Forge 1.8.9 with Fabric 1.19.4. Since the admins talked about upgrading Skyblock's preferred version to 1.19, a lot of players are worried if their device will be able to handle 1.19. So to test this, I'll be comparing them on low and mid-range devices. First, I'll be comparing Forge and Fabric on my PC. It has a Ryzen 5600X processor, an RTX 3050, and 16 gigs of RAM. With Fabric and Sodium on a single player world, I got 1202 FPS on average. And it was completely playable with minor frame drops to around 25 FPS. But those drops were quite rare, so it didn't affect the gameplay. Now with Optifine and Patcher in 1.8.9, I got 1131 FPS on average on a regular world, which is lower compared to Fabric. And I also had more frame drops on average. With my regular mod setup, including NEU and Skytails on a regular single player world, I got 980 FPS on average. It was completely playable with minor frame drops to around 27 FPS. The frame drops were much rarer when compared to Optifine and Patcher, so even though the average FPS was lower, the game was much more stable. When I joined Skyblock Hub 2 with Fabric, the game was literally unplayable with only 1 FPS. But after a few seconds, it became more stable, and I was easily able to play with over 100 FPS in the hub spawn area. But the FPS got a lot better once I had moved to another location, to around 462 FPS on average. When I joined the Skyblock Hub 1 with my Optifine and Patcher setup, the game was almost completely playable with 34 FPS. And after a few seconds, it became even more stable, and I was easily able to play with over 200 FPS in the hub spawn area. Also, the FPS got a lot better once I had moved to another location to around 707 FPS on average. With my regular mod setup, Hub 1 was fully playable with no noticeable frame drops, and it quickly stabilized to over 200 FPS in a few seconds. And it became much better once I had moved away from other players to around 327 FPS. Now the main reason I think the FPS was worse in the regular world but was much better in the Skyblock Hub is because of the Patcher mod, as it is optimized to reduce lag in Hypixel. Then I compared them on my old device. It has an Intel i7-8565U processor, an MX130 and 8 gigs of RAM. Now with my regular mod setup in 1.8.9, I got 70 FPS on average on a regular world, which isn't the best, and it was only semi-playable because of the frequent lag spikes. With Fabric on a regular single player world, I got 80 to 90 FPS on average, and it was completely playable. I also had some minor frame drops, but they were quite rare. With Optifine and Patcher on a regular single player world, I got 70 to 80 FPS on average, and it was completely playable. Also, I didn't notice any frame drops. In the Skyblock Hub 1 with my regular mod setup, the game was completely unplayable for a few seconds with 1 FPS. And it remained unplayable with around 20 FPS when surrounded by multiple people. But it reached 70 to 80 FPS when I moved away from the crowd. When I had switched to Fabric, Hub 1 was still unplayable with 1 FPS, and it remained unplayable with 20 FPS in the hub spawn. But it quickly reached 80 to 90 FPS once I had moved away from the other people. With Optifine and Patcher, Hub 1 was still unplayable with 1 FPS. It became barely playable with 30 to 40 FPS in the hub spawn after a while, but once I had moved away from the other people, it quickly started hitting 90 to 100 FPS. So in conclusion, I think 1.19 isn't that much worse when compared to 1.8.9, but I wouldn't recommend upgrading until mods like NEU and Skytails start supporting higher versions. And once Patcher becomes available for 1.19, I think it has potential to actually be better than 1.8.9. But I don't think my test is absolute. I would recommend you guys to test it for yourself if you'd like to. I'll link guides on how to install Fabric in the description. Also, please share your personal experiences with Fabric and Forge in the comments below. By the way, buy my onions.